This question is from Rosie, who asks, do we think we're in a recession? So obviously, the definition of a recession is a specific thing. It's a period of negative economic growth where GDP falls for 2 consecutive quarters. We're not in that period. But we thought this was an interesting question to answer anyway, because, I mean, in a way, it feels a little bit like we are in a recession, doesn't it, Rachel?
It does feel like a bit like we're in a recession. And it's worth pointing out that even though we are not technically in a recession, if you look at the last 3 quarters of growth, 0.7% growth at the start of the year, 0.3% midway through, 0.1% the latest figures. 0.1%, like given how much room for error there is in those figures, like could it be minus 0.1%? Yes, it could. Is growth basically stagnant? Yes. Like going, yay, we're not in a recession because the figures say we're not. Like it doesn't really address the argument of how people feel and how the economy is doing. In terms of how people do feel the economy is doing, More in Common had some pre-budget polling which I found fascinating, which found that 52% of people in this country do feel like we are in a recession. They do think that's what's happening. So that's a majority. So I don't know if Rosie is in that majority, but if you are Rosie, you are not alone. And it's also quite interesting to look at how this breaks down by party. So only 38% of Labour supporters think that we're in a recession, whereas 63%, so nearly 2/3, of Reform supporters think we are. So, I mean, there are different ways of reading that, but one of the obvious suggestions to me is if your economic reality is pretty bleak, you might be looking for alternatives to the political status quo, and therefore having Labour politicians going, it's great, we had growth of 0.1%, just does not chime with your lived experience at all.
Yes. And I think it affects, you know, if that polling is correct and a majority of people think we're in a recession anyway, that affects behaviour, doesn't it? If you think you're in a recession, you're going to be very cautious with your money, cautious with your career. And actually, you can see from the stats that households are saving more and spending less than before on average. So that has an impact on the economy too, you know, when politicians want people to release a bit more money into the economy.
It could well be an indicator, I think, as well. If lots of people are feeling that, then it could slowly start leading towards us being in recession as well.
So it feeds itself.
Yeah, it's about confidence.
There is kind of a narrative thing with recession, right? You know, that if you start to think that I think what's that famous definition? It's like a recession is when your neighbor loses his job, and a depression is when you lose yours. You know, people can have that kind of sensation of things are going badly. They're looking around and they're starting to see, you know, again, the high crime thing, people on the streets, people stealing stuff all the time. It's all just part of, I think, just general feeling of decline that people have in Britain and from declining living standards. And so I think there is that. I think recession is almost a vibe that we have at the moment. And I do think you're right that when the politicians say, oh no, we've had this like infinitesimal little amount of growth, so technically we're not in a recession, it doesn't feel like a satisfactory answer, particularly when this Labour Party really came in talking about growth.
Yeah.
And it was great. You know, it was great to see a political party say, we want to grow the economy. We want to have this big, successful country. But it also raised the salience of growth, I think, a lot for people. And even when they then began with there's a black hole, the country's been left in far worse shape. I do kind of think the politicians have a responsibility about the narrative around the economy. And if you keep telling people how bad things are and you keep saying we have to tighten our belts, and then you go, why are voters so worried about the economy? It's like you've been making them incredibly worried. Yeah. And even with the latest thing with the OBR about like how bad things actually are, there's kind of a sense of, you know, you are telling people this. Sometimes the figures are actually a bit more positive, but you are in charge of it. So they're going to think of you as being responsible for the decline, for the sense of things going badly. So I do think Labour should be a lot more positive if they want to change people's impressions about the economy.
Yes, and it is a bit dangerous, I think, to give that impression of the economy as like the weather, like something that people don't have any control over and don't have any, you know, choices to make that could make it different. I think it leads to a fatalistic feeling among people. And it is quite disorientating as well if you think your politicians don't actually have any power over this thing that affects your life and your future and your children's future. Then, of course, it leads to that kind of nihilistic feeling that we've spoken about before on the podcast, Rachel.
Yeah, it's a balance, though, because yes, you do want to give them optimism and positivity and hope. What you don't want is to suggest everything's fine, because then you get a disconnect on that level. You get like these are politicians who don't understand the day-to-day realities of how hard it is for me. So I think it's a very delicate comms balance to strike, which is whatever you're feeling, we understand it, we get it, we're doing something to fix it. And the sunlit uplands are just on the horizon. And I just feel that the government just veers wildly between the two. It's either really depressing or everything's fine. And I can't work out like what the coherent messaging of that is. And you end up just not listening to them at all.
Yeah. And relatedly, we have another question on a similar subject. This question is from a listener with a username that's simply an alien head emoji.
Love it.
So
Love it.
Our first extraterrestrial listener. Wow, we've broken space. We must be doing well. They ask, when do prices ever go down? So I really like this question because prices pretty much always rise. So, you know, when you hear that inflation is falling, that's not that prices are falling, that's that prices are rising slightly slower than they were rising before. And that is really important because although the headline rate of inflation has been falling, you still have the cost of certain things rising underneath those figures if you look into them. So on the recent count, fish, vegetables, chocolate, confectionery were all among products that were rising in price. And that makes a big difference to people's lives. You know, if you're going into do your weekly shop and you see that prices are still going up and things are still expensive, then it affects how you feel about, you know, your life. You know, how much money do you have for the things that you want to enjoy? How far are your wages stretching? I mean, the Bank of England has done some research that shows people are still buying the same amount of food, but paying more for it. And I think that has implications for the party in power because it's that Reagan question, isn't it, that I've spoken about on the podcast before. But, you know, do you feel better off than you did X number of years ago? No. Okay, let's bring in a different government. So actually, I think Westminster's quite flighty, isn't it? And we like to talk about all sorts of different reasons why the Labour government is failing. But I think we've kind of forgotten the cost of living crisis is still very much the reality for people, even if those headline inflation figures have come down quite a bit since their peak.
I always think a cost of living crisis is often a crisis of income. It's how much money you have in your pocket. How much are you getting? I mean, the government can control that a bit in terms of with tax.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it is kind of a question of, are workers getting paid better? You know, are the poor receiving more money?
Yeah.
And if they're not, and prices just always go up ultimately, even in periods of deflation, which is terrible for the economy typically.
Yeah.
In periods of deflation, it's usually fuel that's causing it. It's almost never a fall in prices.
Yeah.
Prices just don't go down. And actually, one of the things I find interesting about kind of food in that whole area is that British supermarkets are incredibly efficient because they're constantly at war with each other over prices. They're constantly competing with each other. They also, I think, just generally try to keep prices as low as they can in order to kind of outmaneuver each other. And so, you know, we're probably as efficient as it's going to be. And the prices are still going up all the time. And I think for people, if that's not being matched by wage growth, if that's not being matched by an increase in welfare spending or in pensions, then you are going to feel, oh my God, I'm running out of money.
Yeah.
I think it's really, really crucial to look at prices in terms of everything else. So the Bank of England's aim is to keep inflation at around 2%. So, you know, in an ideal world, prices would be going up by that amount. So prices going up is not the problem. The problem is wages not going up to match them and prices going up so much, particularly on things like fuel, although also on housing. And I think that's a pretty crucial one
rent,
as well, rent and mortgages that mean that your income doesn't stretch nearly as far. The other thing that's happening, and that happened in the budget, and we did talk about this last week, but I just want to stress it again, is that the government has chosen to use inflation to help increase taxes by stealth without people noticing. So prices are going up, your wages are going up, but the tax thresholds at which you pay various levels of tax are frozen. So that means that even if you are getting a pay increase, and like lots of people listening won't have had a pay increase regardless of inflation or not, the government is acting as though you had and taking some of that wage increase for itself kind of without telling you. I mean, she did tell us, Rachel Reeves did say that in the budget, but it's a way of raising taxes. It's a way of capitalising on inflation. And I think that's pretty critical too, because if the key thing that matters, as Luke said, is how much money do you have in your pocket, your wages are growing, inflation's going up, and the government's taking more of it, the difference, the amount you actually have to spend is going to be decreasing and everything's going to feel much more expensive.
Yeah, I remember speaking to an economist at the Bank of England who made this point, who was like, the government don't have control over inflation, but they do have control over how they cushion people from its impacts. And so during the height of the cost of living crisis, even Liz Truss's government was basically imposing price controls, wasn't it, in terms of energy bills. So there have been big interventions to try and cushion the impact for voters. At the moment, you're not seeing so much of that.
Yeah, £150 off your energy bill.
Yeah.
That's basically it.
Yeah, which is basically it, not as significant as some of the things that they were doing in the past. And there are some MPs who think, all we need to do really is focus on getting the cost of living down in some way, whether or not it's through the welfare system, whether or not it's through interventions like that on energy bills, just so that people feel like they have a bit more money in their pockets to do the nice things in life. And I always think the best bits of Keir Starmer's speeches, which I don't always, think are the best speeches that I've heard, are when he makes those points about doing nice things with his family and having that time. I think he had a whole stretch about going to the Lake District one year. And I thought that was really good, because our politicians don't often talk about the good life, but that's basically why people want spare money, isn't it? After they've paid for childcare and food and rent and the mortgage, they want some money in order to enjoy themselves. That's what comes up in focus groups a lot, apparently. It's the surviving rather than living, or surviving rather than thriving.
Yeah, it's the I can no longer afford my kids' ballet lessons.
Yeah.
Or, we can't afford any summer holiday at all. Or Christmas is going to have to be scaled back.
Yeah.
And it's maybe not I'm struggling on a day-to-day, lots of people are struggling on a day-to-day basis, but just the concept of having nice things is so far away that what's the point of it all? And that then you get back to the sense of apathy, which I think takes us back to why people feel like we're in a recession.
Yeah.